The world was a fuse burning at both ends. In the early months of a new global crisis, every capital buzzed with fear, secrecy, and cold calculations. Sanctions had lost their sting. Diplomacy had withered into silence. And beneath the thin veil of speeches and summits, old empires were once again preparing for confrontation. Cyber attacks between rival nations escalated weekly banks in Paris, power grids in Toronto. Even water systems in Southeast Asia were hit without warning. Armed standoffs flared in the Arctic and along oil routes in the Red Sea, and whispers of AI-driven weapons being tested in secret labs only fueled the unease. America, long thought to be the balancing weight of global stability, was finding its influence shrinking under a wave of populist rebellion and deep political fracture. And yet, as strange as it sounded to many, it was Donald Trump who had been called in again. Though no longer president, Trump remained a magnetic force on the world stage, feared and admired in equal measure. World leaders didn't agree on much, but they understood this when chaos threatened structure. You don't call the most polite man in the room. You call the one who breaks the room entirely and rebuilds it louder. That's what Trump did. And so, amid a global leadership vacuum, he was quietly invited to a high-level emergency summit. In Central Europe, a last-ditch effort to coordinate between nuclear powers, corporations, and climate-collapsing regions teetering on the edge of ruin. The summit would take place in an undisclosed, heavily secured compound once used during the Cold War. Attendees were limited. No cameras, no aides, only power players. As Trump's modified motorcade rolled through the crumbling border towns of the host nation, the tension inside his vehicle was suffocating. Intelligence briefings scattered across his lap told a terrifying story. 2 countries were preparing simultaneous preemptive strikes in the Pacific. Food exports from 3 key nations were being weaponized as leverage. Over 50 million people across North Africa and the Middle East were facing climate displacement with no global plan for their relocation. And worse, private military contractors were now outnumbering regular armies in half a dozen conflict zones. "This is different," Trump muttered, scanning a satellite image of new bunker constructions in Eastern Europe. "They're not posturing anymore, they're planning." His top security advisor nodded silently. This wasn't politics as usual. This was the planet bleeding from every corner. The compound they approached was shadowed by fog and surrounded by layers of concrete and fences. Inside, elite leaders and defense directors were already assembling Russia, China, Brazil, Israel, Germany, the UAE, and 5 others who never admitted publicly to showing up. Everyone was there because no one trusted the next 90 days to play out without catastrophe. The agenda was simple: choose cooperation or mutual destruction. Trump was scheduled to speak third in the sequence, after 2 foreign ministers would argue for a new AI arms agreement and a radical space defense pact. His speech, prepared by a ghostwriter and revised 3 times during the flight, was direct, strategic, and heavily loaded with economic threats wrapped in patriotic slogans. It was Trump classic. But as the convoy neared the final checkpoint, something entirely off-script happened. A crowd of protesters had gathered at the outermost security barricade, mostly peaceful. Some angry, all desperate to be seen. They held signs in 5 languages. Some begged for help. Others condemned the summit as too late. One sign read, "You negotiate while we starve. Another talk is cheap when the water's gone." But it wasn't the signs that caught Trump's attention. It was a single figure standing perfectly still just beyond the fence. A girl. No older than 11 or 12. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't holding a sign. She was just watching. Her clothes were simple. Her hair pulled into a tight braid, but in her hand, she held something, a small object, almost glowing in the haze of morning light. And her eyes, they didn't look like a child's. They looked old, knowing, unafraid. "The Secret Service was on edge. We need to keep moving," one of them said. "We have less than 5 minutes to enter the secured corridor." But Trump, oddly silent, motioned for the convoy to slow. "Zoom in," he said. One of the agents tapped into the live camera feed, focusing in on the girl's hand. It wasn't a phone. It wasn't a weapon. It was some kind of carved artifact round. Ancient, etched with symbols no one could recognize immediately. "Who is she?" Trump asked. No one answered. The local authorities had no idea. "She's been standing there since before sunrise." An interpreter radioed in from Checkpoint 2, alone. It was supposed to be a footnote in the day, a strange encounter. An odd child with a rock. But Trump kept watching her as the car rolled past. Just before they turned the final bend into the summit facility, the girl raised the object in the air, just once. As if she were offering it, not shouting, not protesting. Just presenting something, and for reasons he couldn't explain. Trump looked at his team and said, "We need to find her, tonight." Hours after the summit began, the air inside the compound felt heavier than any war room Trump had ever walked into. Discussions unfolded behind sealed doors, each one more hopelessly circular than the last. Generals argued about drone corridors. Economists demanded resource guarantees. An environmental bloc threatened sanctions if desalination tech wasn't globally shared. Trump listened, offered sharp remarks when needed, but his focus kept drifting back to the girl at the fence. The girl who had stood silent amid the noise, holding a strange object like it mattered more than any document in the room. When the sessions paused for a classified dinner, Trump pulled his national security liaison aside. "Find her," he said. "Discreetly, I want her brought here, cleared through the side gate." No media, no noise. The request was met with confusion but not defiance. No one dared to argue when Trump's gut instincts kicked in. By midnight, the girl had been found. Her name was Liana Tevi, age 13. From a village nearly erased by war, drought, and economic collapse, an invisible pocket between broken borders. She had no passport, no social media, and no documented school record for the last 3 years. She was the kind of child the modern world had lost track of. Forgotten until she appeared, holding what the translator described as a sunstone, a relic passed down from her grandmother's grandmother. It was carved from dark amber, etched with swirls and lines that had no known origin. And Liana claimed it told a story not just of her people, but of all people. In a small steel briefing room within the summit compound, Trump sat alone with her, an interpreter, and one security officer posted discreetly at the door. The rest of the summit was continuing, without him, world leaders making temporary alliances over coffee and filtered water, while the most important conversation of the night unfolded with no cameras present. Liana didn't flinch when he asked her why she came. "Because you needed to see it," she said. "Not just you, all of you." She opened a cloth satchel and carefully placed the sunstone on the table between them. It didn't glow like in the movies. It didn't hum. But there was something undeniable in its presence, an ancient gravity. She began tracing the carvings with her finger, explaining that they told a story passed down not through writing, but through memory, generational memory. She spoke of a city buried by time, not just physically but conceptually, lost to arrogance, hunger, and disconnection. A civilization that had grown powerful through conquest and innovation, but collapsed after failing to protect its water, its air, and its ability to listen. Trump watched her carefully. This wasn't a rehearsed tale. It wasn't political theater. It felt deeper, like listening to a dream told in the language of a child who had aged too quickly. Liana said the city had been warned by a child then, too. A seer no one took seriously until it was too late. They thought because she had no rank, her words had no weight, she explained. But her mind wasn't young, it was just new. She then slid a piece of parchment across the table, drawn by hand, in meticulous geometric detail. "This," she said, "is what the sky looked like the day they fell." Trump studied it, blinking. It was a map of constellations, some familiar, some extinct. But it was the pattern that disturbed him, a spiral formation that mirrored exactly the same pattern printed in one of the early warning climate models from his own intelligence files. He'd seen it before, quietly buried in a document flagged as theoretical only. "How did you know this?" he asked. Liana tilted her head slightly. "I didn't." The stone did. The room fell silent. Trump leaned back in his chair, stunned but steady. His mind raced not with disbelief, but with cold calculation. He'd been in rooms with spies, kings, CEOs, even rogue generals. But none had spoken with the certainty of this girl. "You came here to stop us," he said. She shook her head. "I came to remind you." "You still have time." There was a knock at the door. His aide reminded him that his next closed session was starting. Trump looked at the sunstone, then at Liana. He made a decision, that would ripple far beyond the steel walls of the summit. "Tell the others I'm delaying my session," he said, "and bring in the interpreters. I want them to hear this." Within the walls of the summit's restricted communications wing, under dim lights and the hum of surveillance dampeners, Liana sat across from a dozen translators, analysts, and security experts handpicked by Donald Trump. She wasn't overwhelmed. In fact, she seemed more composed than most of the men in the room. Before her lay the sunstone, now encased in a protective glove box handled by artifact specialists flown in overnight from Germany. Its carvings, delicate and strange, resembled nothing in any modern linguistic archive. But as Liana spoke, piece by piece, the story began to unfurl like the slow opening of a forgotten book. Trump stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, silent, commanding. He wasn't listening for politics anymore, he was listening for truth. Liana explained that the object wasn't just a relic, it was a timeline. A warning system encoded in spirals, lines, and star clusters. Her people, she said, were the last oral stewards of a knowledge, passed through the ages not by scholars or priests, but by children, always the youngest. Children remember differently, she said. We don't have enough history in our heads to bury what matters. The others in the room exchanged skeptical glances, but Trump remained still, his eyes fixed on her every word. She described a civilization known in legend as Velura, a place of stone cities and sky bridges, of water machines and long cycles of peace. But Velura made one fatal mistake they began to alter: the balance of natural forces without understanding their long-term consequence. They built deeper into the earth, pulled heat from below, seeded clouds for control, and ignored early signs, rivers drying upstream, insects vanishing, children being born without tears. And when the collapse came, it wasn't fire or war that took them first. It was the air, thickened, poisoned, made unbreathable by a slow, silent chemical process that was never corrected. They didn't die screaming, Liana said. They died quiet, the way cities do. Trump's advisors shifted uncomfortably. Some believed they were listening to metaphor, others weren't so sure. She turned her attention to the sunstone and pointed to one of the outer rings. This symbol, she said, means deviation. When the stars no longer match the waters below. She drew a circle in the air with her finger. When this happened in Velura, within 6 seasons, the atmosphere shifted. One of Trump's science analysts interrupted, asking if she had any dates. Liana looked confused. Dates don't matter when you're counting the sky, she said. Only the patterns. She then unfurled a cloth scroll from her bag of faded constellation chart, drawn in ash and natural ink. This is what the sky looked like in Velurus last year. Trump stepped forward and studied it. His memory snapped back to a security briefing 2 years earlier, one that had predicted a perfectly mirrored planetary alignment due to occur. In the present day, a rare cosmic event long considered irrelevant to geopolitics. But what the Pentagon had marked as symbolic coincidence, Liana now described as a trigger point, a resonance. When sky and earth fall out of rhythm, she said, the balance goes looking for a new song. And it's the children who pay the price. She spoke of one last record from Velura, tale of a young girl, the final keeper of the stone, who escaped the collapse and passed the knowledge on through generations. Her story had been told every decade at the solstice, but few remembered its details until now. The tale was clear when the old powers return and the fires burn cold. A child would cross the wire and warn the one who had walked with fire before. The room went cold. Walked with fire was an idiom in her culture for a leader who had survived massive political upheaval and shaped nations through conflict. The implication was undeniable. The prophecy was speaking of him. One of the intelligence officers spoke up, scoffing. "So this is a chosen one story now?" Trump raised a hand. "No," he said quietly. "It's a systems warning. And we'd better start treating it like one." The real fear began when Trump ordered his team to cross-reference the patterns from Liana's map with satellite atmospheric data. Over the next 12 hours, analysts discovered real-time anomalies, shifts in jet stream behavior, oceanic current changes, and seismic readings that matched the cyclical spiral depicted on the sunstone. Not speculation, not guesswork, actual data. And when overlaid with Liana's timeline, a chilling prediction emerged within 18 months. Certain parts of the southern hemisphere could face a climate chain reaction severe enough to trigger regional collapse. Not in 2100, not in some hypothetical simulation, now. Trump called an emergency briefing. This time, he brought the leaders back into the room, not for negotiation, but for confrontation. He had Liana stand beside him. "She knows more than anyone in this building," he said. "And if we don't listen to her, we won't be negotiating policy, we'll be fighting over oxygen." The silence was long, heavy, but something had shifted. Because in a world where satellite data, military reports, and political forecasts had failed, to align a 13-year-old girl with a sunstone just told them what no advisor ever could: what comes next. The room was built for silence. It was built for control-reinforced steel walls. Low light, quiet air conditioning humming over carpet designed to mute every footstep. But now, for the first time since the summit began, everyone was silent. Not out of respect, but out of shock. The moment Donald Trump stood beside a 13-year-old village girl and announced she had more insight than the combined intelligence of half the world's leadership, the foundations of the summit shook, not literally, but politically. Advisors whispered. Interpreters hesitated. Delegates leaned in. It wasn't just unprecedented, it was unthinkable. Trump didn't care. He knew what they were thinking: has lost it. He's gone rogue. But he also knew what they did that was right. He placed the sunstone gently on the center table, the veins in the amber catching the soft ceiling lights. "Before we go another step," he said, his voice firm, "I want every one of you to take a good look at this." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. He didn't need to. This isn't about politics anymore. This isn't about who gets the next seat on a UN panel or whose economy rebounds first. This is about whether we're even here in 10 years. China's delegate, a seasoned diplomat with decades of steely calm, broke the silence. "You expect us to alter global defense talks based on a child's story?" Trump turned to him without blinking. "I expect you to listen. When a child's story predicts your satellite data better than your own advisors." The Russian official leaned forward, suspicious. "How can we verify any of this?" Trump didn't flinch. "I already did. My team cross-referenced her patterns with 3 independent data sets: oceanic flow, solar activity, and jet stream decay. They match. Better than your own climate simulations?" Whispers rippled through the room. Trump knew he was pushing boundaries. His advisors had warned him that invoking Liana publicly could cost him credibility. But he wasn't trying to save reputation anymore. He was trying to stop a chain reaction. One of his own aides tried to redirect him with a whisper in his ear. "Sir, we still haven't discussed the AI arms proposal." Trump cut him off with a wave. "Forget the tech talks. Forget defense. If we don't address this, the rest is just fighting over the order in which we drown." He motioned for Liana to step forward. "Tell them what you told me," he said. She stood, her presence far too poised for a girl who had never seen a podium in her life. She didn't beg. She didn't stumble. She described the collapse, the way her grandmother's village slowly faded. First, the trees stopped bearing fruit. Then the river turned sour. Then the children started coughing. She described the story passed down from velour, the sky turning to ash, the crops withering under invisible pressure, the songs turning into silence. She spoke of a warning encoded in the sunstone, passed from child to child not as science, but as truth and pattern. "You've forgotten to remember," she said softly, looking around the room. "You have your numbers, but you've lost your rhythm." Her words struck deeper than any statistic. Delegates shifted uncomfortably. A few rolled their eyes, but others, especially the representatives from smaller nations, leaned in. One from Bangladesh whispered to another from Kenya, pointing to Liana's chart and nodding. It was the South African minister who broke the dam. "We've seen similar patterns," she said quietly. Insect populations vanishing in clean zones, sudden algae blooms in winter. No model explained it, but her spiral matches our thermal overlays. Others chimed in, one by one. Suddenly, Liana wasn't a curiosity, she was a key. Trump seized the moment. "This girl is the canary in the coal mine. And I'm telling you right now, if we go back to the scripted summit plan, we lose our window to act." He turned to the Secretary of Defense seated across the table. "Scrap the next 3 panels. Convene a crisis roundtable on climate rhythm, food chain disruption, and atmospheric collapse today." The Secretary looked stunned. "Sir, that's not within protocol." "Then break protocol," Trump snapped. "You want history to remember this summit? Give them a reason." The shift was immediate. Delegates started pulling out notepads, motioning to aides. Whisper networks exploded into controlled chaos. But not everyone was on board. The French foreign minister scoffed. "You're turning global policy over to mythology." Trump leaned in. "Mythology doesn't usually predict your next drought 6 months early." This one just did. By nightfall, the summit agenda had been torn apart and rewritten. 3 global science bodies were looped in by secure satellite. Field researchers began uploading anomaly data in real time to compare with Liana's spiral sequence. The US, China, and India jointly agreed for the first time in history to release restricted climate weaponization models for shared analysis. And all of it, every document, every detour stemmed from a story no advisor had the guts or imagination to deliver. Only she did. The summit compoundants, stiff with protocol and ego, now pulsed with urgency. Just 24 hours earlier, every discussion had been about arms packs, rare earth monopolies, and orbital weapon detents. Now, hallways once lined with security briefings were filled with makeshift climate war rooms, whiteboards covered in spiral pattern overlays, solar radiation data, and Liana's hand-drawn sky maps blown up to poster size. The atmosphere had changed. Something ancient had cracked open, something immediate. For the first time in decades, world leaders weren't preparing for domination. They were preparing for collapse prevention. Trump watched it unfold from the command balcony overlooking the central chamber. Below him, a dozen rapid response teams from nations previously on the brink of economic hostility were now in deep coordination, translating weather data, sharing controlled resource inventories, simulating contingency plans. The shift wasn't just diplomatic, it was existential, and it wasn't his speech, or his influence, or his political legacy that had flipped the switch. It was a 13-year-old village girl holding a relic carved by people history had tried to erase. Later that day, Trump called an emergency trilateral with the leaders of China and India, 2 of the most powerful players in the global resource game. He laid out a bold, almost reckless proposal, a 90-day global ceasefire agreement on all economic sanctions, military escalations, and energy hoarding. At first, both leaders balked. "We will look weak to our people," said the Chinese president. "Only if your people live long enough to remember," Trump replied. That silenced the room. He pulled up a file labeled Red Wire. It was an unreleased Pentagon simulation, predicting the global consequences of freshwater collapse, food riots, and economic burnout if 3 continents reached 1.6 C of localized warming within the next 18 months. "You can hold your ground now," he said. "Or you can watch your cities burn in 5 years while your children try to breathe through cotton sheets." He slid Liana's sunstone pattern across the table, This was carved 1,000 years ago. It got more right than our satellites. India agreed first, then China. Within 48 hours, the ceasefire pact was signed off the record, non-binding legally, but symbolically nuclear. It halted all ongoing cyber hostilities, black market trade blockades, and resource seizures in developing regions. For the first time since the start of the modern resource era, nations agreed to stop acting like owners of the planet and start acting like tenants. Meanwhile, Liana remained in the background, watching quietly, as tribal leaders from her homeland were flown in to speak directly with environmental coalitions. She didn't want cameras. She didn't ask for attention. I only carry the story. She said, it doesn't belong to me, but Trump made sure her insights weren't lost. He ordered her oral history translated in over 12 languages to be preserved as a foundational record in the Global Emergency Resilience Framework, being drafted live during the summit's second week. Then came the moment no one expected. Trump walked into the Central Press, chamber space built for 5-minute sound bites, and staged diplomacy, and tore up his prepared closing speech in front of 24 cameras and 500 staffers. Everything I came here to say doesn't matter anymore, he said. What matters is that we almost missed a signal that didn't come from intelligence agencies, satellites, or spy balloons. It came from a girl with no shoes, holding a rock that spoke louder than our armies. He continued, we spend trillions trying to defend ourselves from each other, and nothing trying to defend ourselves from ourselves. That ends now. If you need to put my name on it to take it seriously, fine. Call it the Trump pivot. Call it whatever you want. But pivot. The broadcast was shared worldwide. Even media outlets normally critical of Trump carried it live without commercial interruption. Political leaders at home were confused. Allies were stunned. Rivals were silenced. But around the world, something broke open. A new wave of leaders, scholars, youth movement, and tech entrepreneurs began echoing the same question. What if the greatest intelligence we need isn't new? What if it's just been ignored? In the days following the summit, nations began uploading their classified environmental data into a new shared network. Corporations offered to release proprietary water tech patents for international licensing. And most shockingly, 6 countries that hadn't spoken in over a decade launched a joint energy redistribution pact designed to stabilize regions most at risk for ecological collapse. This wasn't Trump's usual brand. It wasn't war rooms or campaign trails or billion-dollar trade victories. This was legacy, carved in spirals. And the moment that defined it, a man who once built towers stepped aside so the world could listen to a girl with nothing but the truth. 6 months after the summit, the world wasn't saved, but it was listening. The ceasefire pact, initially mocked as symbolic, held longer than expected. What started as a quiet, experimental truce evolved into a global pause button, a moment for nations to exhale, realign, and reassess not what they had, but what they were becoming. Trade negotiations returned, but with new language, carbon thresholds, soil depletion limits, and climate privilege audits. Weapons tech took a backseat to weather mapping. Instead of escalating military drills, countries began simulating evacuation routes for climate refugees and cross-border drought coordination. The gears of geopolitics hadn't stopped turning, but they were now spinning toward preservation, not domination. And at the center of that shift was a girl no one could find. After the summit, Liana Tevi vanished from the spotlight. No one knew where she had gone. Her family returned to their village, protected now by international aid and diplomatic observers. Some said she had been placed in a private school. Others believed she returned to walk barefoot through the hills, where the stars were clearer, and the sky still sang its warnings. Trump never confirmed her whereabouts. When asked, he simply said, she did what she came to do. She reminded us. Now we carry it, but her voice hadn't disappeared. The Valura Doctrinea name Trump insisted on became the foundation of a new international policy charter adopted by 19 nations. It focused on intergenerational sustainability, atmospheric thresholds, and cultural memory preservation. One of its core principles, children are data sources too. Scientists began incorporating oral history into climate modeling. Linguists joined climate teams. Storytelling, once dismissed as folklore, became vital context for resource mapping and behavior forecasting. The line between ancient and urgent had blurred. Trump, once criticized for brash unilateralism, had rewritten part of the global playbook through a completely different power humility. Not performative humility, but the real kind. The kind that steps aside when truth doesn't wear a suit. For the first time in his career, he didn't take the podium after victory. He didn't build a building with her name on it. He didn't trademark a logo. He just changed direction, and the world followed. Former adversaries approached him differently now, not as a political force to outmaneuver, but as someone who had proven that leadership wasn't about dominance, it was about awareness. Awareness of time, of turning points, of the whispers in the margins. When NATO updated its environmental risk assessments, they included an appendix titled The Liana Factors. When the UN ratified the Clean Skies Accord, it began with a sentence that sent chills down the chamber. We almost forgot the sky had rhythm. And at a private gathering held 1 year to the day, after the summit, Trump stood before a quiet room of international leaders. Not as a speaker, but as a witness. They played a short film. No narration. No political framing. Just images, a girl walking barefoot across a cracked road holding a sunstone that glowed in the sunset, followed by clips of global satellite data syncing with the spiral she once drew by hand. When the lights came back on, Trump didn't say a word. He just nodded. Later that night, in his private office, he opened a box that had been delivered weeks earlier. Inside was a piece of cloth. Wrapped around it was the sunstone. No note. No signature, just the relic worn. Warm and waiting. He placed it on his desk, next to a framed photo of the summit's first day. Then he whispered, almost to himself, still listening. Because in the end, no matter how powerful, how connected, how historically significant a man becomes, the greatest legacy he can leave is knowing when to listen to the smallest voice in the room. And that's what changed the world.